The Walking Dead Saints and Sinners, one of the oldest and most respected VR games, is now 5 years old. Despite thousands of VR titles being released in the following years, it still stands out as a titan in the VR space, and is still my favorite VR game of all time. How has the game aged since its release? Does the gameplay still hold up to modern titles? And what makes The Walking Dead Saints and Sinners the masterpiece that it is after so long? This is the biggest video I have made yet, so if you're a fan of Saints and Sinners like I am, then please consider sticking around as we take a look back at the 5-year history of The Walking Dead Saints and Sinners.
And when the moon turns red with blood, when the moon turns red with blood, Lord, I want to be in that number. When the moon turns red with blood.
Wherever the tourist goes, death ain't far behind.
The first mention of The Walking Dead Saints and Sinners was in 2018, 2 years after the launch of the original Oculus Rift. To give you an idea of what VR games were like during this time, games like Beat Saber and Gorn had just come out, and VR chat was only months away from launching. During the annual San Diego Comic-Con, we got the first ever announcement for a Walking Dead VR title, and this announcement was met with mixed reception. While the TV show and comics have been well received throughout the years, the video games have either had some great hits or some horrendous misses. So while many players were excited about this announcement, a good portion of the Walking Dead fanbase was skeptical about the concept of a Walking Dead VR game. The game was being developed by Skydance Interactive, the gaming division of Skydance Media, whose only game, Archangel Hellfire, also had some pretty mixed reviews. Not much was known about the game itself at the time, other than it was the first VR game in the Walking Dead franchise and took place in the flooded remains of New Orleans, completely outside of the other stories of the Walking Dead universe. Teaser art for this game was showcased in a come-to-life setting at the Harbor House restaurant, and despite my best efforts to find footage of this event, these are the only pictures I could find. At this point, info on the game was scarce, and all VR fans could do was wait. Between this time and 2019, not much news about this game was released, and many early VR enthusiasts were eager for any news on this game. Then, out of nowhere, on October 2nd, 2019, Skydance dropped the cinematic trailer and a release date for the game confirmed to be January 23rd, 2020. Many people were excited, but a good portion of the Walking Dead fanbase was still skeptical about this trailer, given that it didn't show any actual gameplay of the game and was just a cinematic, which, you know, fair. Fortunately, those people would not have to wait long, as from October 3rd to October 6th, the world finally got its first look at Saints and Sinners at its booth at New York Comic-Con 2019. The showcase was a massive success, and those who played this early version of the game responded very positively to the demo they got to play.
It's just the most immersive VR complete experience I've ever played.
A few days later, pre-alpha footage was posted to the Skydance Games YouTube, showcasing some gameplay for those who couldn't attend Comic-Con. This alpha footage showed off crafting, looting, combat, and most importantly, choice making. The Memorial Lane mission was used to show this off, basically from start to finish, with some parts being left up to the viewer's interpretation. The main takeaway from this showcase, though, was that player choice would be a factor in the story and that your decisions would matter. It also looked like there was going to be a karma system for the Tower and the Reclaimed, but this never made it into the final game and only exists in this alpha footage. At the end of the alpha, though, they showcased a horde of walkers and the player fighting them off to the best of their ability. All of these features being shown off in the pre-alpha helped to dispel a lot of skeptics about this game, with the comments praising how polished the game looked and some showing genuine excitement for the release of the game. It was also this time that the dev team also began to release developer diaries of their work on the game, showcasing their vision for New Orleans, the story, the gameplay, and the challenges they faced with developing the game for VR. It was fully clear this wasn't just a studio of indie developers. These were seasoned veterans of the industry who had experience developing multiple console games and were taking on the challenge of developing for VR. Multiple VR influencers at the time were brought in to play early builds of the game and also left very positive feedback on the game they were presented with. These developer diaries and showcases didn't get much attention at the time, but it was clear to those who saw them that this game was going to be unlike any VR game made up to this point. It was going to be a complete experience with a fully immersive world, something that only very few games accomplished up to this point, to various degrees of success. Pre-orders were made available in mid-December for multiple versions of the game at varying price points. The standard version would include the full game, as well as any future updates, which I believe was the most popular option. The Tours Edition came with 3 in-game weapons, themed after the ones seen in the TV show and comics, collectible voodoo dolls which you could find in the graveyard, and the full soundtrack of the game, which also included the Skeptic's Guide to NOLA podcasts and the song used in the cinematic trailer. This would later be included with the standard Quest version of the game, but left out the additional soundtracks due to there being no way of accessing them on the headset. There was also a third option for die-hard fans, the Tower Edition. This version came with the features of the Tourist Edition, but also came with a physical bundle of items such as postcards, a collection of concept art, very small tokens like a challenge coin and a thumb drive, and the unicorn backpack that was used in the cinematic trailer, and a lot of the promotional material. With the pre-orders out and the dev team adding the finishing touches to the game, all players could do was wait for the launch of the game, and thankfully, they didn't have to wait much longer.
But what I still have to ask, tourist, is who are you?
On January 23rd, 2020, Saints and Sinners finally launched, and the VR community was finally able to get their hands on this long-anticipated title. I should note, this was the PC VR release of the game on Steam. The game would launch later on PlayStation VR in May, and the Quest release would also follow in October. When players started the game and booted up the tutorial, they were met with VR mechanics that were far more advanced than pretty much any other game before it. Everything they needed was stored on their body. Weapons in holsters, a large backpack for items, a flashlight that could be recharged by shaking it, and a notebook on their chest with tasks and info. This allowed for quick access to important items and started to build a level of immersion with their body being physically present in the world. Or at least their arms were. This isn't Boneworks, they have a budget. Mechanics such as eating to regain stamina and healing were also designed with immersion and functionality in mind, perfectly mixing the two to keep the player engaged while keeping them immersed in the game. After getting comfortable with the controls, players entered a combat section to experience a physics-based combat system. Killing walkers involved physically stabbing them, heavy weapons like axes felt weighty, and walkers could physically grab and hold onto you until you shook them off. The physics in this game were heavily catered to a specific feel during gameplay, which not only made the mechanics feel more natural and real, which in turn made the game feel more immersive, but also allowed for newer players to engage with without the jank that other physics-based VR games had at the time. While many players just completed the tutorial and moved on with the game, some who decided to have a little fun discovered a very key feature early on. You could kill anyone. While there would be consequences, as clearly shown, you could experience the story how you wanted to, and if you didn't like a certain character, you could indeed just kill them. Once done with the tutorial, we're treated to an interactive intro cinematic, where we get to see the world that we're about to enter, while our first important NPC, Henri Lafayette, narrates it. The state of NOLA is horrific after the apocalypse, destroyed by floodwaters, and currently overrun by the dead. As a result, 2 factions have formed in the city, known as the Tower and the Reclaimed. The Tower is a militaristic faction utilizing cruel methods but all in the interest of preserving humanity's survival and keeping everyone in their community alive. The Reclaimed serve as an opposition to the Tower, with its members expressing creative freedom through some pretty f***ed up rituals and sacrifices, meant to be used as scare tactics against the Tower and anyone who would even dare to oppose them. Both of these factions are currently at war, with the main thing both sides are after, the Reserve. A myth of a military bunker, untouched by survivors or the floodwaters, full of supplies, and both sides are eager to claim it for themselves. This served as a clever end goal for the player as well, as no matter if they were a saint or a sinner, an abundance of supplies is something anyone would love to get their hands on in a post-apocalyptic world. It just so happened that Henri was the closest to discovering the Reserve, so the fact that he's willing to work with us is a great start to getting us closer to the treasure trove of resources. Once the world is set in stone for the player, they're sent off into the world with no supplies or resources, and need to fend for themselves against any oncoming threats. For the early game, this gave players a sense of urgency and also paranoia. You felt very underprepared with very few supplies, and every resource you collected was valuable. Even as players started to explore new areas, this feeling persisted as your limited inventory space forced you to choose if you want to prioritize collecting resources by bringing only the necessities to survive, or bringing more supplies to ensure your survival, with the cost of being able to collect fewer resources. Now, you may be asking, what can you do with these resources? Good question. I'm talking to myself, aren't I? The majority of things you can find in the field can be broken down into raw materials to make new supplies through a simple crafting system. There are 3 crafting benches in your home base, each allowing you to create different types of supplies. One dedicated to healing, food, and stamina, one dedicated to guns and ammo, and one dedicated to storage, survival, and melee weapons. The majority of crafting recipes were locked, but could be obtained by spending resources to upgrade your crafting benches, or some could even be found by simply exploring each area. This, combined with a limited backpack space, made scavenging and managing resources much more of a thought process, as you had to decide which resources you want to go for, and if your backpack gets too full, you may need to sacrifice one or multiple of your supplies for that extra resource to craft, I don't know, what some people like. Oh yeah, a giant f***ing katana. Among these crafting recipes were a wide variety of guns and ammo, and while a good number of them had a modern feel to them, others fit the theme of the apocalypse with their more makeshift appearance. Each gun had great handling thanks to the physics engine, and while some were easier to use than others, all of them had some form of utility, and which gun to use ultimately came down to your preference. The lever-action rifle and Nova shotguns are standouts to me at least, as a lever-action rifle is something we haven't seen outside of any other VR game outside of Bone Lab mods, and the Nova shotgun is the most satisfying pump shotgun that I have used in any VR game. Just listen to the pump action on this thing. The melee weapons were just as, if not more satisfying to use, as jamming your knife or driving your axe into a walker's skull gave some physical feedback to the controllers, which in turn made using these weapons feel immensely powerful. Most players also found that you could throw your melee weapons, giving them some extra range and a way to express yourself creatively if you were going for cool kills. This game did have a durability system for weapons, so eventually your weapons would break, leading to some very unfortunate circumstances if you weren't careful. But even if you ran out of weapons, you could still get lucky by finding worn down weapons, or some resources you find in the field, like frying pans, planks of wood, spoons, bottles, and even the gun barrel itself, can be used as improvised weapons if needed. To put it simply, this game had a very well crafted and diverse combat system that rewarded you for using your weapons in creative ways and left you a fighting chance even if you ran out of weapons. But now that we're familiar with the mechanics of the game, we should explore the areas this game has to offer. The game is described by many as semi-open world. While the level design is non-linear and you can pretty much go wherever you want in each area, the floodwaters prevent any long distance travel on foot, so players would have to utilize a makeshift skiff to travel from location to location. Each location would be tied to the main story in some way, and also contained an abundance of resources, a crafting recipe, a way to obtain a crafting recipe in a different location, or sometimes both. The first location that players start out is in the cemetery. A rundown bus in this area serves as our home base, containing storage, crafting benches, a bed, and a radio which can be tuned to whatever station we want. The radio serves a purpose in the story, which we'll cover in a bit, but tuning the radio to various stations would present us with valuable information on each area from the tower, sermons from the leader of the Reclaimed, a haunted mix of random sounds that just don't make any sense, and some classic New Orleans tunes to jam out to. The bus is definitely more functional than it is luxurious, but many players found this charming, and it fits the theme of the game very well. Exploring the cemetery further lets us see the decaying and unkept nature of this place, and those who explored far enough would run into some catacombs. These flooded and dark hallways are lined with skulls, coffins, and overgrown vines, with the only light source being your flashlight and some candles which for some reason have an infinite flame. Game logic. Walking through these catacombs leads us to one of two areas, Jazzman Park or St. Vincent's Churchyard. Jazzman Park is an empty, open park with a locked shed and statues of jazzmen playing a haunting tune. While not very expansive, it does serve as a story location eventually, and is a nice break from the endless tombs and coffins of the cemetery. St. Vincent's Churchyard is a rundown neighborhood overlooked by a large church. This area is only accessible during certain story missions, but there are still some key points of interest and serves as a location of the final showdown at the end of the game, unbeknownst to the player until it's revealed. Once players are ready to head out into the world, they can head to the skiff and select from a variety of locations. Most of the areas we visit are rundown neighborhoods where we can see the impact of the apocalypse and the floods had on those living here. These areas include the Shallows, Via Corolla, Memorial Lane, Bastion, and Old Town. Despite these locations being functionally relatively the same, their layouts, points of interest, and certain missions help give them a unique identity while preventing any two locations from looking and playing the same. Two locations are part of the warehouse district of New Orleans, Bywater and the Ward. Bywater is the industrial district of New Orleans, containing warehouses for lumber and metalwork and a small auto repair shop. The Ward is a collection of shipping warehouses, each of them being run down and beyond repair, and some of the walls even being caved in or destroyed. Both these locations were very well received by both players due to their unique layouts and the missions tied to each location. And finally, the most infamous and unique location of the game, Rampart High School. For many players, this is either their favorite or least favorite map in the entire game due to its structure. The winding and dark hallways leading to classrooms with messages of desperation scrawled on the walls give this place a very creepy and dark atmosphere. These maze-like hallways truly make you feel alone, and for many players, this is the scariest location in the entire game. Early on in the game, many assumed they could spend as much time in these locations as they wished. However, they would be sorely mistaken, as each area had a time limit on how long they can explore. If players spent too long exploring, they would get occasional beeps on their watch, with the third beep being followed by a chorus of church bells ringing. This in turn would bring in the horde of walkers that would start filling the area from everywhere. While players could try and stay behind to explore more, important NPCs would flee the area, locking them out of any story progress relating to those NPCs, and eventually, players would run out of resources, which would force them to flee or succumb to the endless horde of walkers. This imposed time limit added a sense of urgency to each area. You need to get in, do your task, and get out. As much as it sounds like it rushes the player, it honestly really doesn't. The timer on the bells is very generous, leaving players with plenty of time to explore, complete missions, and leave before the bells start ringing. It was more of just something to keep in the back of your mind, and a way for the devs to nudge their players towards engagement with the rest of the game rather than focusing their time all in one area. All these mechanics and areas create a fun and exciting gameplay experience for players, but the game wouldn't be complete without a great story to go with it. The story isn't a masterpiece like Season 1 of the Telltale games, but it's still pretty good. I'm not gonna go over the entire story, cause I redid that twice, but I will cover the general plot and the importance of each character. The first character we meet is Henri, an old timer who's the closest to finding the reserve, and is willing to work with us to find it. While we only have a short time with him before his demise, his character does have some charm, and his influence helps us connect with other characters we meet along the way. May Benoit and her daughter Ambra are ex-tower members who fled due to the manipulation of the higher-ups leading to her husband's execution. May has a key to the reserve, and while she isn't willing to give it up immediately, she does help us get some more supplies while collecting intel for her from the tower, which in turn gives us enough good faith with her for us to eventually give us the key to the reserve. While we never get to see Ambra through the majority of the game, she draws pictures for us of cache locations and other works of art for us to appreciate. Both Ambra and May serve as valuable forms of information and supplies, and a reminder that there are still good people in NOLA, which unfortunately makes their inevitable deaths all the more tragic. Mama is the leader of the tower, and Georgia is her second in command. We don't see Mama at all throughout the entire game, but we can get an idea of her morals and goals through flyers we see in each area. A similar thing is done with Georgia through collecting intel from May. Mama is presented as a firm but fair leader, while Georgia has a very brash and authoritarian personality, which ultimately helps to explain why the tower uses cruel and militaristic tactics. JB is the leader of the Reclaimed, and we can hear him occasionally giving sermons on the bus radio. He's presented as a very charismatic individual with a sense of logic and creativity. And while many players can respect his unique perspective on the world, his preachiness has pissed off some people in New Orleans, and his bizarre view on the reserve can lead many players to distrust him. All of these characters serve a purpose in the overarching story and help highlight the conflict between the Tower and the Reclaimed. But ironically, the most important character in the game has nothing to do with either faction. Casey is a character we interact with the most, but never see until the end of the game. He is the one who confirms the reserve is real over the radio and works with us to help find the reserve, because unfortunately for him, he is stuck in there and needs our help to get out. Despite us never seeing him throughout the entire game, his character development through our conversations over the radio feels genuine, and a lot of players grew very attached to Casey. Casey is the best written character in the entire game, and this writing is crucial because of the final decision you have to make at the end of the game. Remember how I said that player choice was a major part of the game? Well, the name Saints and Sinners has a very clever double meaning, as every choice you make in this game ultimately comes down to who you are as a person. You can either be a pacifist who saves as many people as you can, or you can be a psychopath who kills every NPC you meet. A lot of choices you make write a thin line between your identity of being a saint or a sinner, with two examples standing out the most. The Memorial Lane mission requires us to gain access to one of the houses being controlled by a patrol of tower troops, and the patrol leader needs your help to free his kidnapped brother from some reclaimed troops in a nearby house in exchange for free access to supplies in the tower's house. However, when you talk to the Reclaimed to negotiate the brother's release, the Reclaimed troops explain he was a direct cause of one of their daughter's deaths and wants revenge on the tower for kicking them out, offering the same deal for killing the brother. This puts the player in a tough spot. Do you kill the Reclaimed troops to free the brother who has done some horrible things? Or do you kill the brother and side with the Reclaimed to take revenge on the tower? Neither side is entirely correct, and this choice rides on the thin line between being a saint or a sinner perfectly. While that choice is very intense for many players, nothing compares to the final choice we have to make at the end of the game. Throughout the game, we find various pump regulators to help fix the pumps to helpfully free Casey. When the reserve is revealed and all hell breaks loose, we sneak into the church where the reserve is, and we can hear Casey's plea for help at the pump control panel. Despite our efforts to fix the pumps throughout the game, something went wrong and the flood water isn't draining. There are only 3 options on the panel on where to redirect the water. The armory, where the bulk of the supplies are located, the comms room, where Casey is stuck, or both, destroying the reserve entirely. This forces the player to choose what is most valuable to them at this point. Do you save Casey, the person they've come to know throughout the entire game, sacrificing the supplies you were promised? Do you sacrifice Casey and take the supplies you rightfully earned? Or do you destroy the legend that is the reserve by flooding everything? This is the ultimate choice the game was leading up to. Are you a saint or are you a sinner? All of these factors make Saints and Sinners stand out as a unique and complete experience when compared to every other VR game at the time. The mechanics and gameplay were simple enough for new players to understand, and the physics being catered to certain gameplay elements helped them feel super immersive and fun to use. The design of the game puts survival horror front and center, with its well-crafted and atmospheric elements and the inventory and crafting system forcing you to make tough choices about what resources you need to collect to make supplies. The cherry on top of it all is the story and the player's choice in the story. Everything you did felt like it had some impact on the story, and every choice you made ultimately came down to if you were a saint or a sinner. The game was received very positively by the VR community, and once players had finished the main story, they were eager for any news on what would come next for this masterpiece.
High alert, all tower troops. Receiving reports of a large stockpile of supplies from... This can't be right.
After the main story of Saints and Sinners was complete, all the players could do at this point was gather supplies and try to collect any last recipes they missed out on. While this was fine for some of the more dedicated players, hoarders, most players were left wanting more. And thankfully for those players, more content was coming, and coming very soon. On July 14th, Skydance dropped the bombshell known as a Meat Grinder update. While it didn't add any new post-game content just yet, it did add a bunch of new stuff for experienced players of the game. The update came with the Absolution Katana, the casual difficulty, which toned down the difficulty for newer players, and most important of all, the Trial. This horde-based mode put the player up against 20 waves of walkers, each increasing in difficulty as they slaughtered their way through them. It included 3 different maps to choose from in this mode, including well-known areas like Via Corolla and Memorial Lane, but also included an expanded version of the Graveyard that provided players with a brand new map to explore and a new perspective on the place they originally called a safe haven. While crafting still existed in this mode, resources were replaced with a token-based system. Better weapons and gear obviously costed more tokens, and the way you earned these tokens was by, you guessed it, killing walkers. Players will be rewarded with extra tokens for killing walkers in more creative ways, and to help with the sheer difficulty of this mode, there were walkers hanging upside down from various structures that would provide either melee or ranged weapon boosts depending on which weapon you kill these walkers with. This mode was very difficult, and players who either died or made it to the end would be met with a score screen, displaying how well they did based on how many walkers they killed, how far they got, how many tokens they collected or saved up, and multiple other factors. While this did provide players with a new and fresh way to play the game, the post-game was still barren and lacked any new content outside of looting. It seemed like this was the end of content for Saints and Sinners. And then out of nowhere in April 2021, Skydance dropped a trailer for their second free DLC, Aftershocks. More story, more post-game content, more conflict between the Tower and the Reclaimed, and more supplies from the Reserve? I remember just finishing my first playthrough of the game the day before this announcement, and waking up to see there would be more post-game content coming made me ecstatic. So the community waited for the release, and in May 2021, it got delayed. Okay, look, game development is hard, and Skydance was literally trying to shove an entire game engine update into this patch, so obviously there was going to be some issues. So we waited a little bit longer, and on September 23rd, 2021, the update finally launched. Upon launching the game, players were immediately met with a new option in the menu called Aftershocks Quick Start. This option served as a way for players to skip the main game if they didn't have a save file at the end game yet, or they somehow lost their save file and didn't want to play through the entire game again. While this option would disable achievements for the save file, it would also provide players with tons of resources and all the recipes on the crafting table unlocked, except for the ones you need to collect out in the field. This was a very smart move on Skydance's part, as it removed a lot of the frustration some players had needing to play through the entire game again, but also allowed for Aftershocks to be replayable endlessly if players so chose. Upon loading into the game, players would hear a voice on the radio if they were tuned into the right station. This would send the players on hunts for multiple caches from the Reserve, each being heavily guarded by troops from either the Tower or the Reclaimed, with each cache being full of supplies and unique trinkets. The formula went as follows: wake up, listen to the Tower radio, find out where the next cache is, fight your way through whoever was guarding it, get the cache, get out. One of these caches even contained blueprints for the upgraded UV flashlight, which opened up a whole new way for players to explore areas they were already familiar with. The Graveyard had pictures of Ombre and UV ink, and plenty of the main areas either had directions for supplies or had various other cool little details, some of which were a callback to the real-life axe murders in 1918. Or at least, that's what we thought they were. The main theme of this update was revisiting old areas with a new challenge. While it was true that many players were familiar with these old areas, going through them again to find the Reserve caches, while avoiding or taking out the Reclaimed or Tower troops, provided a unique challenge that got more challenging for each looted cache. This post-game ultimately came to a climax when, after returning from a very challenging raid where both sides were fighting for a weapons cache, you got robbed! Remember the karma system I briefly discussed in the pre-alpha footage? Yeah, it somehow got worked into the story of the game because now the Tower and the Reclaimed are both pissed at you for stealing all the caches for yourself. Players who fought their way to take out the Tower and the Reclaimed troops in the Graveyard would eventually find out where part of the scrap was, but nowhere near enough to create any new weapons or items. If they wanted it back, they would need to fight for it, by returning to Via Corolla and taking out both the tower and reclaim troops. This immediately brought back the feeling a lot of players had at the beginning of the game, that feeling of being underprepared no matter where you went, and it was thrilling. Once players got their scrap back from Via Corolla, the endgame was essentially over. There wasn't much else to do from that point on, as no further reserve caches were spotted. But there was still one mystery left unsolved. While looting some of the caches, players would collect 3 mysterious keys that seemed to serve no real purpose. That was, until players used their new UV flashlight on the map in the bus, which highlighted Bastion as a place of interest. Upon returning to Bastion, going to the house that wasn't part of the 2 main missions showed cryptic messages relating to the 3 keyholes, and exploring the house revealed that it was indeed the place for the 3 keys. Once the keys were inserted, the washing machine in the house would suddenly start moving, revealing another bunker. And climbing back down into the bunker, players were met with complete shock. Those UV drawings of the Axemen around New Orleans weren't just referencing NOLA's history, they were foreshadowing a new threat, the New Orleans Axemen. Not the original one, an imposter. Someone taking on his likeness to spread fear throughout NOLA. And on his desk was a postcard for the French Quarter and his hit list with some of the names already crossed off. This reveal was completely and utterly shocking to the entire player base. This entire DLC, all the new content, was more than just endgame content. It was a giant teaser for a second Saints and Sinners game, referencing places like the French Quarter and characters we were yet to meet like the Pawn King and the Axemen. The community was endlessly speculating about what new stuff would be coming in the second game, but much like the DLC, all we could do was wait.
And when I finally find you, tourist, you will see what a broken man has to offer.
2022 saw the release of multiple trailers for Retribution, building up more and more hype for the game. During the April Metagaming Showcase, we got the first teaser for this new game, and the trailer mostly confirmed what we knew from Aftershocks. The cinematic portion showed off the French Quarter overrun by walkers, and we got our first glimpse at the new, very imposing villain, the Axeman. We also got some gameplay showing off an early version of the Speakeasy mission. I mean, yeah, overall, the game does look a lot better now. Wait, hold up, is that a motherfucking chainsaw? Groovy. To say the community was excited about the chainsaw was an understatement. We would get the next trailer during the PlayStation State of Play in June. This trailer finally gave us our first look at Mama, another sneak peek of the French Quarter, and a new area of Bywater, along with multiple new weapons including a sawed-off shotgun, SMGs, and a knife that Mama was holding that would later become a pre-order bonus for the Quest version of the game. This trailer showed off the direction the game was going, away from the survival horror nature of the first game, and more into the action with more walkers, more enemies, and much more weapons to play around with. Much like the first trailer, it was received very positively, and fans were dying for even more gameplay. It just so happened that a demo of the game would be shown off at Gamescom 2022, and those who attended got to play an early version of the Speakeasy mission. The demo started in Bywater, in the Pawn King's shop, acting as the start of the mission and introducing us to a new character, the Pawn King. One thing many players immediately picked up on was that this mission started out during the nighttime. So the idea of being able to go out and scavenge for resources at nighttime was a very exciting prospect for a lot of players. The Pawn King would task the player with going to Hotel Eclair, and upon arriving, players would meet Father Carter in a very drunken state. And it's obvious given how janky these animations look. Upon finishing the conversation, or killing him like Gamertag VR did, players would get the key to the speakeasy, and once inside, players had access to the SMGs, a chainsaw, and plenty of other weapons. The mission wasn't too complex, just shooting walkers, turning off the speakers, but the end of the mission showed off Father Carter, if he's alive, running away from the Axeman as he squeezes his way into the speakeasy, blocking your escape. This was super epic to watch, and gave off the impression the Axeman would be a stalker-like enemy like Nemesis from Resident Evil or Slender Man from his very long list of fan-made games. Oh, how wrong we were. The final trailer was shown during Meta Connect, and it was easily the biggest trailer we had gotten yet. More gameplay of the French Quarter, more hints to the actual story of this game, including a revolution against the tower, and a f***ing grenade launcher? If hype for the game wasn't at its peak already, it was at its highest once this trailer was released, and so many people were excited for the launch of the game in December. However, there was one small detail that a lot of people didn't notice, and I don't blame them, given that it was very sneakily hidden until a couple weeks before the game launched. The December launch of Retribution would be a Quest exclusive launch, meaning if you wanted to play the game on PC or PSVR, you would have to wait until those versions were available. This infuriated some fans who didn't have Quest headsets, but a lot of fans were willing to overlook this detail if it meant we got the game sooner. Yeah, that's usually never a good sign. Regardless, Retribution launched on December 1st, 2022, and if you were there during the launch of the game, you know exactly what's coming.
And I vow to spell it. When the bells ring, the song they sing will be righteous.
On December 1st, 2022, the game would launch on Quest headsets. Much like its predecessor, this game had a deluxe version featuring reskinned weapons for the FS pistol and the sawed-off shotgun, collectible postcards in each area, and a storage shelf for any collectible demon or angel statues you collected out in the field. Those who bought the game before December 31st would also get the Chosen as a crafting recipe, which many recognize as Mama's Knife from the trailers. Given this game's status as a sequel, many of the immersive gameplay mechanics and well-known areas carried over from the first game, but there were some new mechanics added, and some of the older ones were expanded on. Starting with the title screen, we were given the option to transfer our save files from the first game. This allowed players to carry over any progress they had made and pick up where they left off. While this feature wasn't functional until the day after the game was released, players still had the option to start on a fresh save with some supplies that the game gave them. Night mode was one of the biggest features to come to the game, giving players the option to go out and scavenge at night, unlike in the first game. Scavenging at night would be more risky due to the low visibility and the increased number of walkers, but also provided some unique rewards and opportunities. New items could be found and broken down into new materials, with a UV flashlight helping to reveal these items, making them easier to see. Dead bodies of survivors can also be found with backpacks of supplies, ranging from completely worthless to insanely useful. Each area would also have groups of exiles willing to trade supplies with you, each one requesting different items and giving different rewards. Completing all the trades in one area would reward players with new supplies that could not be obtained normally, such as silencers, jugs of creatine, recurve bows, and herbal bandages. While in theory, these were a cool idea, they were very tedious to complete due to how specific the trades were, and many players felt like the rewards either weren't worth it or were extremely annoyed by having to visit each area 4 separate times just for some niche rewards. Outside of one mission tied to the story where you had to do one of the trades, many players only did a few full trades or ignored them entirely. Overall, the night mode was well received, and many agree it was one of the biggest hits when it came to improving the mechanics of the game, even if the exile trades were kind of a miss. Finally, the combat system was expanded on through the introduction of new weapons and attachments. These could be accessed through doing exile trades at night, or by crafting them in the 2 new crafting benches in your home. The first bench consists of recipes for 2 new SMGs, an elephant rifle, 2 double-barreled shotguns, and the Big Bertha itself, the chainsaw.
Groovy.
The other bench was a bit more focused on survival, containing recipes for flares, barbed gloves, MREs, laser sights, and of course, the grenade launcher. These recipes would require the new items from the night mode, so even if you had a stockpile of items from the first game, you could not get a jump start on the tables from the second game, which in my opinion was a very smart move. All the new guns and weapons felt very good to use, and aside from some small bugs with the chainsaw, they were also very well received by the fanbase. All these new mechanics were very well done in terms of expanding the old systems to allow for new content, and as a cherry on top of all the new content, we had new areas. 3 new areas were open on the map, 2 of them located in the French Quarter, and one of them being located in the downtown district, which, you can probably guess which location that is. Hotel Eclair consisted of a few narrow streets surrounded by a large, rundown, and abandoned hotel, where its maze-like hallways gave off a similar feeling to Rampart, but due to the open windows and doors in a lot of rooms, darkness wasn't really an issue except during night missions. Later on in the story, we'd also be able to explore a secret speakeasy in this place, as well as a sewer system, both showing signs of decay and rot due to their lack of maintenance. Bourbon Street actually shares its name with another real-life location in the French Quarter of New Orleans, and while it's not a direct copy of the real-life version, it does share a lot of similarities, being a collection of streets surrounded by local businesses, all showing clear signs of decay. Finally, we have the tower. Located in downtown New Orleans, this imposing behemoth was surrounded by a few streets packed with abandoned vehicles, a cramped parking garage, and a decaying and dark hospital. Those who got too close to the tower would find it swarming with guards, making any attempt to approach difficult unless you came well prepared. Once the time was right, players would be able to access the inside of the tower and eventually the top floor, but only for a brief period at the endgame. The tower itself had a lower mall area consisting of some local shops, and the upper floors consisted of some offices and some residential apartments. The top floor contains a penthouse suite where Mama does her business, but in order to reach there, you literally had to climb on the edge of the tower just to go from floor to floor, which did provide a great view of the city, but also, this area had some fairly mixed reception from the community. The tower itself was insanely cool and very well thought out, and the dark hospital was genuinely frightening, but the wide open and long streets and the mostly empty parking garage were seen as unnecessary and seen as a detriment to the overall design of the area. In addition to these new areas, some older areas got some new sections relating to the story. Our base got expanded to essentially be a f***ing mansion. Via Corolla got a new house and backyard to explore as part of a night mission. A section of Bywater served as the home of the Pawn King, and the ward had a new warehouse blown open during an Axeman incident, giving us a look at more offices and a shipping section, which acted as the area for the final fight against him. All these new changes were received fairly positively, and in combination with the night mode, were a breath of fresh air for those who had gotten tired of seeing the old areas over and over again. So with all these improvements made to Retribution, why was this game received so poorly on launch? And why is it still received poorly to this day? Well, it really comes down to three main factors. First and foremost, the price. For many players, the number of new features in this game didn't add enough to justify the $40 to $50 price tag. The new features were cool, but the base game was still the same, and a lot of mechanics we could experience in this game were already present in the first game. Most of the community felt like this was a glorified DLC, with some making comparisons between this franchise and the Resident Evil 2 and 3 remakes, which, yikes. Secondly, the bugs. This game was insanely buggy on launch. Remember when I said, yeah, that's usually never a good sign. Visual and gameplay bugs were common, but what killed the game on launch for a lot of players was the number of soft locking issues and the crashes this game had. These issues were unforgivable in the eyes of many players, and to give you an idea of how many there were, I'm gonna try to list them all for you right now. Killing the Revolution members in the reserve would soft lock your game. The speakeasy mission would randomly crash, and you would also be soft locked. Walkers could sometimes turn invisible, you get the idea. The game was buggy as hell, and to this day, a lot of these game-breaking bugs are still prevalent. And finally, the nail in the coffin for a lot of players, the story and the characters. Again, I covered the full story already, I'm not doing it again, but I'll still give a quick rundown on the summary and discuss the characters. The reserve in the first game ended up being a complete bust, and 3 months later, the reclaimed are mostly gone, the tower is gaining more and more power, and a new group led by a charismatic priest is formed with you as an ally. An incident with Old Town with the Bells caused it to be overrun by walkers and uninhabitable, and this is presumed to have been caused by the Axemen. From here, the story of the game is split between two subplots, the revolution against the tower and the Axemen's revenge plot against you and the rest of NOLA. While on the surface, these plots seem very interesting, these subplots come with a caveat that the story drives you rather than you driving the story. A lot of the nuanced choice making from the first game is just gone, and instead of making choices that you think would benefit you in the long run, you're told what to do and where to go. To be fair, the Axeman plot forces you to make certain choices, given he's actually trying to kill you, but in the Revolution plot, where you expect to have more nuanced choices, they just aren't there. You don't get to choose if you want to be part of the Revolution or not, or even what choice you make during the Revolution, outside of taking the extreme way out. And you are forced to align with the Exiles and the Revolution, and they tell you what to do and when to do it. You are no longer a solo survivor in the apocalypse, making choices that either follow your moral compass or benefit you in the long run. You are quite literally a tourist. This is made even worse by the fact that most areas aren't utilizing the story at all. Obviously, the devs want to give the newer areas some extra attention. They're new and shiny, so obviously they want you to spend more time here. But outside of Rampart, the Ward, and Via Corolla, you have no other reason to visit the older areas, and you're even discouraged from doing so by having Old Town and Via Corolla and potentially the entire city overrun by walkers, making it an absolute hellhole to go to these locations. Despite this complete dismantling of the choice system and the underutilization of most of the game's map, the characters unfortunately made the story worse. Almost all the characters felt underdeveloped or had some seriously wasted potential, with Father Carter, the first main character we met, being the worst offender of this. We only see him 2, possibly 3 times during the game. Once during the intro where he's at the highest point in his life, the second time in the exact same location, being drunk out of his mind, and if he's still alive at the end, a 3rd time during the tower raid. There is almost no other mentions of him outside of these scenarios, and as a result, his character feels like it serves almost no purpose outside of establishing a connection between us and the exiles. He feels like he has some depth with his religion, but despite being the leader of the exiles, he doesn't help us with the revolution, he doesn't help us with the Axemen, and he doesn't even help us with the trade network, the thing he established himself. We quite literally get him some blueprints for him at the beginning, watch him drink himself into a depression, refusing to talk to us, get him his mother's ashes so he will talk to us, possibly give him some more booze, and have the choice to kill him at his request. While this choice feels like it was meant to have the same nuance as the choices in the first game, it didn't have the same impact because Father Carter provided no value for us, and having us go through the entire speakeasy mission just for him to want to die feels like the mission itself was a giant waste of time. Father Carter is undoubtedly the worst written character in this game, and his potential as an impactful character was just wasted. The Pawn King was a step up from Father Carter, but also feels like he has some wasted potential as well. His character at least feels like it serves a purpose, and watching the ongoing feud between him and his daughter Desiree adds a level of depth to their characters, which is unlike any other characters in this game. However, his name is the Pawn King. He runs a pawn shop, and outside of one very boring exception, we cannot trade with them. They could have very easily modified the trading system to also work with the Pawn King, but the fact this isn't there feels like such a waste. A similar sentiment can be said about the Axemen. Early on in the story, it's revealed the Axeman is Garrick Benoit, May's husband, who we assume was dead at the hands of the tower, but was spared as a sign of mercy and exiled instead. He assumes that you were the one who caused her death, which makes you his prime target on his hit list, and throughout the game, we see his rampage throughout New Orleans, sending a message to you that he is constantly watching and is waiting for the perfect moment to strike. His character is built up so well, and at any moment, we are expecting him to pop out and start chasing us, but he never did. Despite the teasers showing him off as a stalker-like enemy, we only fight him once during his boss fight, which is epic, don't get me wrong, but it feels like such a missed opportunity to not have him chasing us through each area, again, acting as a stalker-like enemy like Slenderman or Nemesis. Now through some digging, some people found some code and assets that hinted at this mechanic being planned, but mostly due to a rushed release, it never made it into the full game. Much like the Pawn King, his character felt developed and had an impact on the overall story of the game, but not having the stalker-like enemy behavior that was teased in the trailers felt like it was such a missed opportunity, given the fight shows him exhibiting this exact type of behavior. It was a cool fight, don't get me wrong, but again, the wasted potential hurts. The Revolution members, I'm be honest, I forgot they existed until I was recording the script. Their characters don't offer anything interesting to the story, outside of the fact that they're revolting against the tower. And they lack any depth to them, outside of Echo being ex-reclaimed and wearing cat ears for some reason. Sable is only memorable because of her shocking death, and Barnes quite literally has no reason to be there. She barely talks and does nothing. They only serve as a way for the player to learn about the tower's plan to flood the city with walkers, and you can skip this entire plot just by killing them when we first meet them. And finally, we come to Mama, who surprisingly breaks this cycle by being the best written character in the entire game. The first game builds her up as a strong leader of the tower, providing exposition on her struggles to build up the tower and her strengths as a leader, with her showing mercy multiple times by choosing to exile JB, May, Garrick, and other people, with most of the corruption coming from Georgia rather than her. She wanted desperately for humanity to flourish and survive, and the Reserve was her golden ticket to this goal. But once the Reserve was revealed to be a bust, her idea shifted from saving as many people as she could to only saving a few, while sentencing the rest of the city to a merciful death at the hands of the horde of walkers. The mechanized bells that flooded areas with walkers were not the Axemen's plans, It was hers, and it was meant as an act of mercy rather than an act of fear or control. Our one encounter with her at the end is somber, and her willingness to let us make the final choice of saving or dooming the city by controlling the bells shows that she was a tough leader, but is still willing to lead the fate of the city for those who are still alive. In my opinion, she is the best written character in both games. It's a shame that many players unfortunately did not play through the entire game to see this fateful encounter with her. With all these factors taken into account, the negative reputation of Retribution feels fairly deserved, as it fundamentally abandons a lot of the story and choice elements that made the first game incredible, doesn't provide enough content to justify the price, and to this day contains several game-breaking bugs even after multiple patches. Despite all this though, a good number of players enjoyed their time with this game, while others wrote it off as the worst game they've ever played. Would I personally say it's a bad game? Not really. It's not quite the masterpiece that Saints and Sinners was, but saying it's the worst VR game on the market feels unfair. It's still a decent game, and if you're looking for an action-packed experience with tons of stuff to do, it's at least got you covered on that front. Regardless, this game did tarnish the perfect reputation of the first game, and many players were left hoping the PC VR and PSVR launches would come with fixes to this game and would hopefully save this game from its horrendous reputation. A few months after the Quest's launch of Retribution, the game finally made its way to PC VR and PSVR 2 in March of 2023. The PC and PSVR launches added a new bow to the base game, The Orphan. This bow was clearly inspired by Clementine's bow from the Walking Dead Telltale games and acted as another nod to the rest of the franchise. Unfortunately though, this was also bugged for a few days, as the recipe would not appear on imported saves. While an attempt was made to fix many of the bugs from the Quest version, a good number of them still carried over to the other two versions, and while the game would go on to receive a handful of bug fixes until May, since then, there have been zero updates to any version of the game, and it's still unclear if the game is ever going to get another update in the future. Ironically enough, the original Saints and Sinners got another update in 2024, updating the Quest version's visuals to Meta's new Quest 3 headsets that had just launched a few months prior. Whether or not Retribution will get the same treatment is still up in the air, but if it does, a lot of players are hoping that it will come with a lot of bug fixes, as well as a trial, which is still absent from the game to this date. But now that Retribution has been out for 2 years, many players are asking, what's next? While the majority of the community is hoping for the release of a third game, so far, we haven't gotten any news about it outside of the official Twitter account responding to some interesting comments. Speaking of the Twitter account, it still remains active to this day, but the only posts currently being made are promoting both games and anytime both games go on sale. There was also a VR cover giveaway for custom face pads for the Quest 2 based on Retribution, and I just so happened to be one of the lucky winners who received one in September. Yeah, this would later be replaced in less than a month by my Quest 3. Despite the lack of support, some players have taken matters into their own hands by modding both games to add all sorts of new and wacky content. This small team of modders appears to be led by Substatica, with most of his mods, such as the God Phone, being well known amongst the community. Some of the more diehard fans of the community also have been able to uncover some cut content from both games over the years. The most well known of these are some of the weapons from Retribution, including an SMG-like pistol, Lee's axe from the Telltale games, and a chainsaw with 2 handles. While these cut weapons are unavailable normally, Substatica has been creating a bunch of different saves, ranging from useful to wacky to excessive, and some of these saves include these cut weapons. There was also a cut flat screen version of Retribution. This was most likely for testing purposes, but the amount of features it has is honestly kind of impressive. As far as I could find, there wasn't much cut content from the first game outside of an unused knife, which seems to be a placeholder, except for one smaller detail that many players to this day don't know about. The main character wasn't originally intended to be the tourist. It was meant to be this girl from the cinematic trailer, and her name was Lynn. And while it's not clear why she was cut, my best guess is that she was cut to allow for gender selection in the final game. This seemingly marks the end of the Saints and Sinners franchise. No future content has yet to be hinted at, and fans are still left waiting to see if Retribution will ever be fixed or updated. Hey, real quick, this is Editor Nerd here. As I was getting footage for this video on my Quest 3, would you look at that? Retribution now has a new logo. I mean, look at this. I don't know, but it certainly is weird given we're getting an updated picture now when it's been years since this game has been updated. But even though this may be the end of Saints and Sinners, it's not the end for Skydance Games. In late December 2024, they launched their new highly anticipated game, Skydance's Behemoth. While it's not the same as Saints and Sinners, a lot of the core mechanics from the game exist to some degree, and they've either been updated or completely reworked for this new medieval combat system with parries, dodging, grappling, and a plethora of new content. It's been received mostly positively thus far, and I personally think it's the best VR game of 2024. Granted, it's not in my top 10 VR games of all time, but it's definitely up there with some of the better games I played like Bone Lab and Blade and Sorcery. It seems like Skydance Games is going through the redemption arc, and we'll just have to see where it all goes. This franchise, without a doubt, is one of the biggest VR franchises to date. From the early teasers and gameplay, it was clear the original game was going to be something different, something new, and something very ahead of its time for VR as a medium. This launch not only brought many Walking Dead fans into VR, but continued beyond the sphere and became what some consider to be the first game that could sell a VR system. To this day, it still stands as one of the most renowned VR games, and despite all the incredible releases we've gotten over the years, it remains to be my favorite VR game of all time. Excuse me. While Chapter 2 attempted to improve on the success of the first game, and did so in some areas, it came with a whole host of bugs, and honestly didn't carry the same magic the first game did, leaving many fans to neglect the existence of the second game and continue to sing the praises of the first game. While a good number of players are still hoping for a third game, I personally think the franchise would be better off without one. It seems Skydance is currently branching out with the release of Behemoth, and if they were to return to Saints and Sinners, it most likely wouldn't be with the same energy or love as the first game. The franchise's story has been concluded, every major loose end has been tied up. I say, let's be satisfied with what we have after they fix Retribution. Please, Skydance! Okay, second editor nerd here. Apparently Retribution is now just $10. So never mind, I guess they just gave up on this game. This video has been one of the biggest projects I've undertaken, so if you enjoyed it and want to stick around for the rest of my content, please consider hitting that subscribe button and liking the video. If you want to see more Saints and Sinners content, check out my story explain videos I did for both games, as well as my initial review of Retribution. If there's ever any future Saints and Sinners content, rest assured, I will be there to cover it and give y'all some more incredible content on this franchise. If you want to keep up with my socials, you can find me on my Discord server, on TikTok, or I forgot to finish the script, so I'm just winging this. Anyway, if you're still listening to me yap, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you all in the next video. Have a good night, y'all.